Welcome, everybody, to this podcast introduction to this week's Listening to America, a conversation with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky about 10 things relating to the relationship, I won't call it friendship, between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was born in 1757, we think. I mean, he fudged that a little bit, we think. Jefferson was certainly born in 1743. Hamilton died in July 1804. Jefferson lived all the way to 1826. Jefferson was not the last of the founders. That would have been James Madison, but he was there for a long period. He lived 83 years and was able to shape the history and the discourse of the early national period in a way that most of his adversaries and friends were not able to do. So it's a fascinating subject. We talk about a whole range of issues today. Number one, the bank bill in 1791, where Hamilton got the National Bank of the United States against the objections of the strict constructionist Thomas Jefferson. Number two, the Maria Reynolds sex scandal and Jefferson's complicity in the leaking of that to the public. We did not really talk about Hamilton's collaboration with Madison, but it sort of came up implicitly a couple of times. Hamilton's anxiety about his illegitimate birth. He was born illegitimate in the Caribbean, and it kind of haunted him. More him than I think others, but it was used against him, and sometimes even by the Jeffersonians. Jefferson's and Hamilton's competition for the love and support of the great father, George Washington. Washington had no sons. Both Hamilton and Jefferson had no fathers by the time they met in the cabinet of the United States in 1790. Their behavior in the cabinet, Jefferson went on to say that they fought like two cocks, two roosters in the cabinet, what that was like, and Lindsay is the world's expert on that subject from her book on the cabinet. Hamilton's role in the election of 1800, where he sort of wound up supporting Jefferson in the contested election with Burr, not because he particularly admired Jefferson, but he certainly didn't admire Aaron Burr. The famous duel, and Jefferson's very detached response to all of that in the only letter he ever wrote about it, a letter to his daughter Martha. The famous dinner party that Jefferson hosted when he just got back from France, to determine whether the funding bill would pass and whether the national capital could be sited in the Upper South on the Potomac. That famous compromise occurred at a Jeffersonian dinner party, we think. And then, of course, slavery, which always comes up. Hamilton was a principled antagonist to slavery. He was part of the New York Manumission Society. Jefferson was all over the map, of course, in principle against slavery. But it's not really what you say in the end, it's what you're able to do. And Jefferson was able to do almost nothing. Anyway, it's always great to talk to Lindsay. She's really added a lot to my life in both ways. She's a serious Jefferson detractor, I would say, or she probably would object to that. She puts Jefferson in his place. There's more balance in her view than most Jefferson people allow. But she also is very, very well read and smart and insightful, and she's taught me a lot. I'm really glad to have this relationship with her. We've never been in the same room together, but she's now a central figure in my life, and the collaboration has been terrific. When I travel, people say, oh man, do we love when Lindsay gives it to you? But they also say we love it when Catherine gives it to you, and they also say we loved it when Swenson gives it to you. So I guess I don't know if there's a common theme there or not. Anyway, everybody, it was an amazing time in my life. I'm teaching an online course at the moment about books of the road. My next online course, and you can find out all about this at ltamerica.org, will be on religion in the space program. Strange spiritual things happened in the space program, the most famous of which is the reading of the first 10 verses of the book of Genesis from lunar orbit on Christmas Eve 1968. I can remember that as if it were yesterday. But more, for example, Edgar Mitchell in Apollo 14 conducted ESP experiments from lunar orbit with people back home holding up cards and vice versa. And some of the astronauts who went to the moon came back and became evangelical preachers. And so it had an effect. This is Newtonian science. These are engineers who have been trained, just the facts, just the data, just the readout of the dials. But you can't go to space without at least having the opportunity to open yourself spiritually to what that must mean. And then there's something called the overview effect, and it has to do with the famous photograph from Apollo 8, Earthrise, where we see the Earth rising above the horizon on the moon, and one of the most important photographs ever taken. And this leads to something called the overview effect, which argues that once you've seen the whole world at once, so you don't if you're in the space station because you just see a continent here and an ocean there. But once you see the whole world in a single glance, the theory is you never really look at anything the same way after that. That this changes some fundamental thing in your consciousness. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm fascinated by it. So that's coming in the spring, the religion and the space program. One of my very favorite subjects. When I was young, I barely remember Mercury. I certainly remember Genesis in our schools in Western North Dakota. They would roll in a television on a cart to watch some of the launches of that. And I remember where I was when Neil Armstrong first walked on the moon, and I remember Ed White's spacewalk, and I remember many of the most important moments in all of this, Apollo 13, although I think the film has probably taken over our actual memories of that event. So it's something that I find fascinating. And I guess what I want to say is how lucky I think I am. And I'm so lucky in having all of you, because I get to range over the map, whether it's Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, or Virgil's Aeneid, or St. Augustine's Confessions, or the letters of Erasmus of Rotterdam, or Shakespeare's plays, or John Donne's holy sonnets and sermons, or Milton's Paradise Lost, or Moby Dick, or Henry David Thoreau, or Religion and the Space Program, or the life and tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, or the explorations of Lewis and Clark and John Wesley Powell and Sir Richard Francis Burton, one of the seekers for the source of the Nile. I've been very, very fortunate. This last week I gave a 2-hour Smithsonian talk on Eliot's The Wasteland. Before that I had talked about Gulliver's Travels, or whether Huckleberry Finn can survive the 219 instances of the N-word in it. I'm going to be doing a retreat at Laxaw Lodge on Moby Dick and the Epic of Gilgamesh here shortly, and another round, this time in Los Alamos, about J. Robert Oppenheimer. It's just a lovely thing. It's exhausting. I am a little exhausted right now because I've been burning the candle at 4 or 5 ends here lately. But what a thing. And then also Books of the Road. So I've reread On the Road a couple of times in the last month, and now I'm rereading Travel to Charlie for the 9th or 10th time. And I'm also reading a book I read first in college, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is not holding up quite as well as I would hope. But there are book after book after book on the subject of the life on the road, beginning with Marco Polo and coming all the way to contemporary times. So I love what I get to do, and I love it that you're part of it. And I hope you will continue, tell your friends, fund us if you can, so on and so forth. But this is, in many respects, the golden time of my life, and I've been realizing that it's so much about you, that I'm not talking into empty space here, that there are people all over the country, to a certain degree, outside of the country, who take some satisfaction and solace in having a weekly conversation in full sentences, a weekly conversation that attempts to be centrist and attempts to be evidence-based and attempts to be wry and at times funny. This is what I've dreamed my life would be. I wish the megaphone were a little bigger, but not too much. And now next year I get to go see what John Steinbeck called this monster country. So thanks to all of you. Happy holidays to all of you. I look forward to a spectacular 2024, and I can't imagine doing it without you there to help. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. And across from me today is my friend, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Today, 10 things about the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Welcome, Lindsay, and you have a book coming out in 2024.
I do. It will have both Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. It will come out in August of 2024, although they are not necessarily the central character, although they do play a very important role.
Oh, well, that's my first question. So Jefferson and Hamilton, you know, all of your life you hear about. This is the yin and yang of the early national period. It's Jefferson and Hamilton fighting like two cocks, as they put it, in the cabinet of George Washington, and these are really the ends of the spectrum of American possibility. I'm not sure that's true. I think that the better debate is really between Adams and Jefferson, because they both wanted a republic, but they had very different ideas of how to make that work.
Certainly, I think the more rational debate. I think that Hamilton is such a colorful figure, and he really became the person that best exemplified the more extreme wing of the Federalist Party. And as Jefferson's Republicans were in office, a lot of the more moderate wing of the Federalist Party sort of got subsumed into that large tent. And so what we had left with was this, sort of small rump of extreme radical Federalists. And so I think that, we remember Hamilton as perhaps in some ways the Federalist force, but I don't think that that is accurate. And in fact, most Federalists were much more moderate and agreed with Adams and were more amenable to Jefferson than their antagonism would suggest.
Jefferson surprised them a little when he turned out to be a much more moderate president than they might have projected. So, do you believe, before we get on to 1 through 10 here, that Hamilton's June 18th, 1787 address to the Constitutional Convention, in most respects, accurately outlined the government he wanted to live in, president for life, for example?
I'm not sure. I think that I have shared this theory perhaps with you before, that in some ways it might have reflected some of his interests, but it also might have been a very savvy political move. And so for those listeners who haven't heard my theory is that the Constitution was at a bit of a logjam, the Constitutional Convention was at a bit of a logjam, and they were trying to figure out what to do with the executive. And Madison and Hamilton had been very close cronies up until this point. They had worked together to try and get the Annapolis Convention going. That didn't work. They had worked together to try and revise the Articles of Confederation. That didn't work. And they worked together when they both initially got to the convention. So what happened when Hamilton gave this speech, first of all, it was so darn long that by the time he was done, he was done, everyone was like, okay, I think we're just going to go home today. And then when they came back the next day, Madison put forth what was quite a departure from what they had been discussing as a proposal, but seemed unbelievably moderate in comparison to Hamilton's outlandish 5-hour strategy. And so I can't help but wonder, and I don't really have concrete evidence for this because they, really didn't keep a lot of records at this moment, but I can't help but wonder if they hadn't sort of planned that in some way. And so certainly Hamilton thought there was no reason that Washington shouldn't serve for life, which would have been, president essentially for the rest of his life. But I'm not sure he necessarily would have thought that for everyone.
Well, let me now switch hats with you and sneer and snort the way you do. Are you kidding me? This is the pro-Hamilton defense. I've heard it many times, and not just from you. It was a trial balloon. He was trying to get them to move a little bit to the right, and so he said something far right, and then the compromise would be much more moderate, but it would still fulfill something of his vision, that he didn't really mean what he said when he said governors to serve for life and president to serve for life and governors to be appointed by the national executive, that we need to see this as just a gambit. Really? I mean, come on. If this were Jefferson and the situation were reversed, you would say it's important to take people at their word.
Well, I do believe in taking people at the word. That is true. Although I think we've often discussed that Jefferson says one thing and does another. So that is frequently a part of our calculation. I take your point, and there's no doubt that Hamilton had much more radical views than some of the other people present. I would never disagree with that. The reason I hesitate is he then became such an ardent supporter of the Constitution with the Federalist Papers, and such an ardent supporter of the Constitution once it was in practice. If it was really that far of a departure from what he had envisioned, I don't know that you would see that sort of support. Of course, we'll never know, because unless someone has a treasure trove of documents hiding in their attic, which I suppose is in theory possible, any partnership they may or may not have at that point is sort of lost to the archives of history.
Well, fair enough. So he did give that 5-hour speech, and as you said rightly, the response was sort of just to move on. I mean, it didn't lead to a debate. It was just almost sort of mentally tabled as, that's interesting, but now let's write a constitution. I've always felt that he meant it. The last things that he ever said really on earth were that the Constitution was a shilly-shally thing, a thing of milk and water, that he had, more than anybody, he had given his life to trying to support the fabric of the thing, even though it wasn't in any way ideal. So we don't know, right? And he died young, and he didn't have a chance. He died, at 47? He didn't have a chance to revise his views later in life, as some of the others did. But this comes to one of our lists. So let me just give the list. Hamilton's Bank Bill. That's in the administration of George Washington, when Jefferson and Hamilton crossed swords in a constitutional way. The famous Maria Reynolds story, and Jefferson's involvement, or Jefferson's cronies' involvement in that scandal. Hamilton's collaboration with Madison, you touched on it. They were very thick during the period leading up to the ratification of the Constitution. Hamilton's illegitimate birth and how that dogged him through life. Jefferson's and Hamilton's competition for the support and affection of the father figure, George Washington. The two of them in the cabinet of Washington. The contested election of 1800 and Hamilton's amazing role there. The duel, of course, in 1804. And the famous dinner that Jefferson set up on behalf of Madison and Hamilton when they settled on the national funding proposal and the new capital of the United States, and of course, inevitably, slavery. So let me start with this famous dinner party. Jefferson has been in Europe for 5 years. He's literally out of touch. I don't think he realizes that there's been a kind of conservative reaction to the revolution, that people are rethinking some of the more idealistic and utopian things that were circulating during the first months, some of the more radical and utopian things that were circulating early on after the revolutionary moment began. When Jefferson comes back, he's the Secretary of State. Hamilton's the Secretary of the Treasury. There are only 4 members of the cabinet. Hamilton is trying to get the country to get on a firm fiscal footing, and so he decides that the national government should absorb not only the national debt and pay it off, of course, but it should absorb the state debts too, because this would not only make things a lot faster and more efficient and improve the credit rating of the U.S., but it would tie the states more fully to the new experiment, the new national government. Jefferson hosts the dinner, pretending that he's completely neutral in all of this. He's just a man with great wines and good cuisine. And during that famous dinner, they hammer out a compromise that Madison will make sure that the funding bill passes the next time it goes through Congress. But in return, Hamilton will get the New Englanders and the Federalists to accept the idea of a national capital in the Upper South on the Potomac. Is that fair analysis?
Well, it is certainly the story that Jefferson tells. So one of the challenges with this particular moment, and I think actually this is an area where there's a song in the musical Hamilton called The Room Where It Happens. And what I like so much about this song is it really gets at, it's talking about power and influence and wanting to be in the place where decisions are made. But one of the underlying themes of it is, if you're not in the room, you don't really know what happens. And the only way you can find out is if people tell you or if they left documentation. The only documentation we have of this dinner is a description that Jefferson wrote many years later. And we know that sometimes his later recollections were crafted with a particular intention in mind. And that intention was not always 100% accuracy. So certainly there were two sides. There was an assumption bill that Hamilton wanted to get passed but didn't have the votes. Madison wanted the future capital to be in Virginia but didn't have the votes. Out of some compromise in some fashion, they both agree to swing support to the other. How that happens is not totally clear. We do believe that there was some form of dinner. Whether that was when the details were hammered out, we don't know. But sort of the loose overall outcome certainly is correct.
So Jefferson says, in a somewhat self-serving memory of all of this, that he was new. He came back. His mind was on the French Revolution. He hadn't been thinking about these things. And he's walking up and down the street in New York, and Hamilton is disheveled, and he's nervous, and he's talking about resigning, and he looks melancholy and defeated. And Jefferson, they go arm in arm, says Jefferson, the way men sometimes did in that era, and they stroll up and down the street in front of the president's house. And Hamilton said, it's all over. If we don't get this funding bill, it's all over. And Jefferson said, at the time I didn't really understand. I never really understood economics, but I agreed for the good of the country to call this dinner. And the dinner then led to the Great Compromise. So I don't know that that's necessarily 100% wrong, but I'm sure that Jefferson is making the best possible case for two things, Lindsay. One is that Hamilton was at wit's end and ready to resign, which I doubt. And the other one is that Jefferson was completely blindsided by this, that he didn't really understand the economic thing that Hamilton was about to try to do to the country. And if he'd known more about the machinations and the centralization policies of Hamilton, he might have resisted.
Yeah, I think that even if Hamilton had been at his wit's end, he wouldn't have gone to Jefferson. They were not particularly close. They had yeah, I mean, they had respect for one another, but they were not. I don't know that Hamilton would have confided in Jefferson in that way. And second, I think that Jefferson had a very clear understanding of what Hamilton was saying. I think what Jefferson did not initially comprehend was perhaps the scale of Hamilton's financial plans, but those unfolded slowly. And so he certainly understood the assumption piece when he sort of agreed to support it or to tacitly support it with the compromise.
Lindsay, we need to take a short break, but before we do, a quick answer, please. Why did the Jeffersonians, I'm going to call them, want so badly for the capital to be in the Upper South on the Potomac in Virginia?
So many reasons. One, it was convenient. It was closer to home. That was useful. Wherever the capital was placed, that region was going to have an enormous amount of cultural and political and economic influence over that area in terms of trade and everything else. And the third reason, of course, was slavery, because if it was in an abolitionist state, it would make it harder for Southerners to bring their enslaved servants to that place and would make it easier for those individuals to self-emancipate.
We need to take a break. When we come back, I want to follow that up, even though we're only on point 1 of our 10 things about Jefferson and Hamilton's relationship. I think this is so important. We need to follow up a little. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to a special edition of Listening to America. Welcome back, everyone. I'm talking with my friend Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, who has a new book coming out this year in August. So we're all really happy to be, in some ways, observers of this process for you. What a great achievement. I can't wait to see the hatchet job you do on Mr. Jefferson in that. But leaving that alone for the moment. Okay, slavery. Tell me if I'm too cynical here. Almost every proposition that the Southerners made from 1787 until well after the Civil War has to be read in part with their protection of slavery, that slavery is the thing, that they do not want slavery to be meddled with, to go away, to be overregulated, to be overtaxed, and that when we see something and it looks like where you're going to put the capital, or it looks like what you're going to do about the Second Amendment, or where it looks like states' rights, behind that, kind of peeking to the surface, almost like a hidden iceberg, is enslavement.
I don't know that I would say that every measure had a focus on defending it, but it certainly had something to do with it. Because, for example, sometimes when Congress was discussing financial measures or discussing treaties with foreign nations, of course, the different economic considerations of the different regions of the nation factored into whether or not they supported these treaties or these economic measures. And the primary form of industry in the South was agriculture, which was supported by slave labor. So it just was so fully enmeshed in every part of life that it's impossible to sort of take that away from how they thought about anything, because it shaped so much of their outlook on foreign policy and trade and politics and culture and economics and everything in between.
I think you're being a little too kind to these Southerners, but we'll let it go for the moment. All right, so last question along these lines, Lindsay. Jefferson and his followers insisted that the capital had to be in Virginia or in the Upper South, and it happened. What difference has this made historically?
Well, we're one of the few, I mean, there's so many differences, but we're one of the few nations that has a separate political capital from our economic capital. And so I think that has had a real impact on the evolution of the nation. So, for example, if you think about Great Britain, London is the thing, and Paris is the thing in France. But here, New York is the center of the financial heart of a nation, and Washington, D.C. is the political heart. And it's almost impossible to explain how that has shaped things, but it certainly has had a big impact on our identity and how we have evolved. It had a huge impact on the run-up to the Civil War and the evolution of race relations after the Civil War, because there was always the question of what was DC? Was DC a slave state? Was it a slave territory? Was it a place where free African Americans could live and work and have their families? Could they vote there? Could they own business there? As these questions began to be resolved, so for example, once slavery was abolished in Washington, D.C. was just across the river from Alexandria, Virginia. Before it was abolished, it was one of the biggest slave trade locations, and that was obviously going to be incredibly awkward for Northerners who had abolitionist sentiment. So I think that its location as really on the border of all of these issues, it just permeated the life of people who were both in DC, but also Congress could never get away from it.
Jefferson is a utopian. I think that's indisputable. So he makes the argument that a new capital for a new republic should be in a new place that doesn't have any history, that Philadelphia might have been the natural place to put the capital because it was the largest city in America, it was the most cultural city in America. It was a city ready to go, and people want to live there. That has to be part of this story, right? That Jefferson is always thinking like this.
Yeah, and I think there's actually, a lot of good faith basis to that argument. I think in the past, talked about Congress's fear about relying on a state to defend it. So there was a real argument to be made that it was really important that Congress oversaw the territory and oversaw its own defensive needs so that it didn't have to rely on a state or a state militia to provide defense in the event of a mob or a domestic insurrection. And those fears were really based on things like Shays Rebellion and Freeze Rebellion, and then some of the conflict with soldiers during the Revolution. Jefferson's argument about culture and creating a space from nothing, there's real beauty and symbolism in that. He wanted the architecture to remind citizens of the values of a republic and why they were trying to do this thing. They wanted to have the city layout include a lot of green space so that people would have good quality of life. They wanted it to be well organized to avoid some of the really poor housing conditions and sort of slum-like areas in a lot of older cities. And they wanted it to be inspiring to foreigners who visited to understand the project they were trying to create. Those were all good goals. I don't object in any way to those goals. I think that they could have been created in a lot of different spaces. And so they didn't have to exist on the banks of the Potomac.
You're well aware that Jefferson and Hamilton were both competing for the ear of George Washington in the first cabinet. That's one of your specialties, of course. When it came to blows, they were each writing painful letters to Washington saying the other guy is a creep. He's wrong. He's terrible for America. He's attacking me personally, or his lieutenants are attacking me personally. Jefferson did worse, I think, in this than Hamilton. I think Hamilton had a slightly more professional response to this crisis. But Jefferson then said in one of the letters to Washington, "Here's a man from the moment that history can be said to have stooped to recognize him." I mean, that's clearly an attack on Hamilton's legitimacy. He's basically saying, he's not one of us, Washington. Are you sure you want, even he may have merit, but are we sure we want him to be central to the government of this country?
Yeah, and that's one of those arguments. For all that we think of Washington as being this very high and mighty person, and he did end up that, but that was only because of a number of very unexpected twists of fate. He was born the third son of a relatively middling plantation owner, and his father died young, which meant that he didn't have the funds or the support to get a formal education, and really had to figure out a way to support himself for a while through sort of his own merit and as many connections as he could find. And he worked as a surveyor. As a result, Washington always had, I think, a lot of respect for self-made men and an understanding of what it was to have to be self-educated or to support yourself. While I think he always probably saw himself as Hamilton's better, I don't think he would have taken kindly to that type of argument.
No, I don't think that worked with Washington. And this is where Jefferson is upsetting and unreliable to me, Lindsay, because he didn't just say what Adam said, like, this guy's a bastard. Jefferson plays this game of language from the moment that history can be said to have stooped to recognize him. That's sort of like Teflon language, where if he has to, he can say, that's not really what I meant. Jefferson does a lot of that in the course of his life. Do you think if Hamilton had been one of them, a Pennsylvania grandee or a New York grandee of some sort, that he would have fought a duel with Aaron Burr in 1804?
Gosh, that's an interesting counterfactual. My gut says no. My gut says he would have been much less trigger happy on the duels, pun intended, if he had been more secure about his background and his economic prospects.
Yeah, trigger happy is kind of a double irony, since if we can believe the story, he wasn't going to fire at all or fire harmlessly over the head of Aaron Burr. All right, so Let's move on because we have so much to get to. The bank bill. So the famous bank bill, all right, just to set it up, Hamilton, Secretary of Treasury, Jefferson, the Secretary of State. Jefferson regards Secretary of State as sort of prime minister, but Hamilton behaves as Treasury is prime minister, and he decides we need a national bank, that this is going to be so much easier if you have a clearinghouse, and if we can amortize the debt through bank bills and so on. We need some currency to be traveling around the country. We're cash short. He realizes that the Constitution does not enumerate a national bank, but he believes that it is necessary and proper. It comes out of the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. The Constitution says, look, we've made a list of all the things we think we should do, but other things that are necessary and proper to fulfill those goals have to be allowable too. So Washington is, I think, instinctively Jeffersonian in this way, but he's practically Hamiltonian. And so he asks the principal members of his administration to weigh in. And Jefferson writes a totally brilliant statement, maybe the best statement ever, of limited constitution, strict construction, and deference to states' rights. Hamilton replies with an even more persuasive and brilliant argument saying, oh, come on. If we're going to be a great nation, we're going to have some flexibility in this thing. If we want to straitjacket ourselves every time we want to do something, we have to see, if it's not specifically enumerated in the Constitution, now we have to amend the Constitution. That's a failure of any realism about what happens in a great nation state. And Washington then sides with Hamilton, and we get the first national bank of the United States. Jefferson never gets over that, although he learns to use it during his 2 terms as president. My view is that Jefferson's argument is brilliant. It's great. It's in some ways I want to live in that nation. I don't particularly want to have a CIA. I don't particularly want a national security apparatus. I sort of like the idea that these small R Republican utopians were trying to keep the lid on what can happen to a government. But Hamilton was right, Do we want to be a 4th or 5th rank farmers nation where nothing much happens? Is that your goal, Mr. Jefferson? What say you?
Yeah, a couple elements of this story that I think are particularly interesting or worth highlighting. So the first is, at this point, the way international finances work, there were a couple of factors that were shaping how Hamilton was thinking about finances. So first, we didn't have a Federal Reserve. We didn't have anything like that. And so when the United States needed money for something, whether it was to pay off existing debts or to create a navy, for example, they had to go to foreign nations to get loans. And depending on how the state of the international community was or how the state of their loans were, the interest rates on those loans could be really quite exorbitant. And so one of the ideas was, if you have a national bank, you can have a lot of people invest in it, and that will be a source of funds for the nation if they need it to tap into a loan. And that was something that was actually used quite effectively. So this seems like it makes a lot of sense to us. It was not revolutionary at the time because it was a model that was borrowed from Great Britain. Britain had a national bank, and it had enabled really the British Empire to be what it was. But it wasn't all that common. Britain's version of it really was revolutionary and had been very unique when it first arrived on the international scene. Where I can't quite get a read on what happened was Jefferson responded first. And it almost, let me back up and say that it almost looks like Washington crafted this series of interactions to give him a reason to side with Hamilton. So they had discussed the national bank. He knew that Jefferson and Madison, who was still a close advisor, and Randolph were opposed to the national bank. Randolph was the attorney general at the time. So he asked Jefferson to explain why he was opposed to it. And Jefferson, as you said, writes this lovely treatise. It's a couple pages, not too long, explaining his objections. Washington then gave Hamilton Jefferson's argument and allowed him to write a very lengthy rebuttal. So he's setting Hamilton up to be able to address all of the weaknesses in Jefferson's argument, but does not give Jefferson that same opportunity, which is unusual for Washington. That's not his standard practice. And that implies to me that Washington understood that this might be unpopular, especially with a lot of his fellow Virginians, but he needed a reason to say yes.
I agree with your analysis of this. I think Washington was a pragmatist. I think Washington knew that whatever Jefferson writes is going to be formidable, that Jefferson's always formidable and persuasive. And therefore, we have to overcome Jefferson's concerns directly, or this will become a political nightmare for everybody. And I think he then set it up so that Hamilton would get, in a sense, the last word, and be able to counter Jefferson in a really effective way. And I think it's a form of great statesmanship on the part of George Washington. I'm sure Jefferson would not agree with this. But what delights me about this moment, Lindsay, is that both of these two ministers wrote papers that it'd be hard to think that any cabinet member in recent administrations could write this effectively, this thoughtfully, this intelligently about key issues.
And as quickly as they did.
I see a cabinet meeting with Hamilton stating his mind pretty directly in incisive sentences. He was a gentleman, but he was a policy wonk, and he was aggressive and direct. I see Jefferson then always almost fainting, and he doesn't really want to talk about it, and might we think about this, might we think about that. That Jefferson's character as a sort of a above the fray farmer statesman does him no good in these things, because Hamilton is going to be much, much, much more effective. And Washington Washington knows the world of Jefferson. He knows the Virginia aristocrats and how they operate. But he needs to get stuff done.
Yeah, I think that's certainly what Jefferson wanted. What's so interesting about the cabinet dynamic is that, first of all, regular cabinet meetings don't start occurring until Jefferson and Hamilton already pretty much hate each other. So the first meeting doesn't happen until November 26th, 1791, which is 2.5 years into Washington's administration, at which point Jefferson has already said that he wants to retire. There are a handful of meetings in 1782, and then they pick up with a vengeance in 1793, and the cabinet meets, I think, 51 times in 1793. Sometimes 5 times per week, up to several hours per day. Most of the meetings took place in the summer in Philadelphia without air conditioning. And when they were meeting at the president's house, they were meeting in Washington's private study, which was about 15 by 21 feet and was smushed with furniture. So it would have been a very uncomfortable meeting space, and not a whole lot of room and not a whole lot of personal space. What's really interesting about the documentation of the cabinet, and thankfully Hamilton and Jefferson both wrote their own versions of these meetings, and so you can kind of triangulate between the two of them what probably happened. But even taking Jefferson's with a bucket of salt, it's clear that Hamilton, as he was wont to do, would go on and on and on and on, and at times speak for 45 minutes uninterrupted in this room, and probably gesticulated wildly and maybe even paced, because that's what he did when he got on the subject and felt the passion for it. What I find most interesting is that Jefferson then gave it back. So he didn't like engaging in these conversations. He didn't want to engage in these conversations, but he did anyway. Now, I don't think he was talking for 45 minutes at a time uninterrupted, but he was definitely debating with Hamilton, and they were going back and forth, and they were at it with each other. At this point in 1793, it was over Genet and France and the neutrality crisis. But they were really battling. And there's a reason he called the cabinet meetings cockfights, which, by the way, I used once that quote as an article title, and it was one of my all-time favorite moments as a professional historian. Yes, a journal article let me do it. I was shocked. I was very pleased with myself. I was very happy. Anyway, so I think that that vibe, it shows that Jefferson wanted to be above the fray and was happiest when he was above the fray, and obviously didn't like the conflict, but could get down dirty in the mud if he needed to.
I think Jefferson understood that the future of the Republic was at stake here, and we were making these decisions. This is sort of the burden of your book, that the Constitution is inexplicit about many things. This has to be worked out as the country begins to face its challenges. And if you get it wrong, the rest of time is going to reflect that these things have to be laid down with great care. And Jefferson wanted a minimalist government. He sometimes called the national government the foreign department. He really believed the states were more competent and more legitimate to make these decisions. He was always a Virginian first, and I think that goes back to Hamilton's obscure beginnings. He was not attached to any one state in quite the same way that Jefferson and Madison were super attached to the destiny of their own Virginia. Do you think this got heated? Do you think that tempers really flared in these conversations, or did they maintain a kind of a gentlemanly restraint?
Oh, no, I think they definitely got heated. I think they got very intense and very passionate, and there were times when Washington would basically call a timeout, and they would go downstairs and have what Washington called a family dinner, so his official family. they would have a dinner, and it was his way of trying to cool tempers and trying to take a break and trying to ensure that they remembered that they were all on the same team and develop an esprit de corps. But no, I think it got quite nasty sometimes, and sometimes it got heated for ways that wasn't intended. So apparently when Henry Knox would get bored, he would introduce the subject of various articles that had come up in the Aurora at over the past week that were particularly critical of Washington, just to like poke him, and make him mad, which evidently worked quite well. So I think that it got hot and heated. Not, I mean, just like the cabinet. I'm sure maybe not cabinet meetings today, but certainly the president loses his temper with advisors. That's, I think, that's a constant in American history, because the decisions are so intense and the stakes are so high, and you're spending so many long hours working on these subjects, and you lose your temper. And I think that's just kind of how it goes.
And people care. We need to take a break. We'll be back with more conversation about 10 things in the relationship of Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the third segment of our program, Listening to America. This one on Hamilton and Jefferson. Lindsay, cockpit, the British government had a room they called the cockpit, and Dr. Franklin was dressed down in it in a really humiliating way once. So I think Jefferson would say that he was fighting for the future of human liberty. I think that Hamilton would say something like, no, we're actually doing policy so that the nation can pay its bills, mind its business, have an army, control its borders, and so on. I'm sure Hamilton was really annoyed by Jefferson's constant jumping up into the high-minded area where it's always about some vision of America rather than what are we going to do about the fact that the British want to cross the country to fight with Spain on the West Coast.
Yeah, I think so. Although I do think that Hamilton saw what he was doing as fighting for the future of the nation. He genuinely believed the nation would not survive without these measures, and at least on some of them, I think he was correct. And so they both, one of the reasons their hatred for each other began to burn so hot is because, and this is one of the arguments that I make in the cabinet, is that they wouldn't have hated each other quite so much had they not spent so much time with one another. They began to think that the other was really a mortal threat to their vision for what the nation should be. And they wouldn't have had that conviction had they not been in the cabinet together all of the time. That's really one of the things that spurred them to try and take action against the other person, is because they saw up close and personal the threat that they thought the other posed.
We need to be careful when we think we live in a time of unprecedented hostility. I'm guessing that if you had a little Lindsay cam into the cabinet room, that 12 by 15 foot room, we'd have some pretty interesting transcripts and a great deal of body language, too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are things about our current moment that are unprecedented, but it actually helps to highlight the severity of those unprecedented things by not overhyping the rest. So it is important for us to acknowledge that we have been intensely partisan divided before, and that we've used horrific rhetoric, and that there has been a lot of political divide and intense political parties. Those things have existed from time to time and tend to be cyclical in American politics.
The demonization of the other. I hope that this is a cycle that will soon slow down a little and the temperature will come down. Back to our 10 points on Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Maria Reynolds. So Hamilton gets caught in a tawdry love triangle, blackmail scheme, and it's sad. He writes a public letter about it. But the part that I'm interested in is Jefferson's complicity here. So Hamilton is thought by the Jeffersonians to be fiddling with funds and a cronyist and helping his buddies get insider trading tips and so on. That there's corruption at the heart of his work as the first Secretary of the Treasury. We know this is almost certainly without any evidence at all, that this is really not true. When the Reynolds story broke, Hamilton was confronted by James Monroe and a man named Venable, and they came to say, look, what's going on here? And you tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but Hamilton said, look, here's the deal. I'm being blackmailed. It's this horrible thing. I shouldn't have done it. It's horrible. But it is not a public issue. It does not in any way color my work as the Secretary of Treasury. And as I understand it, Monroe and Venable said, fine, we're gentlemen, we accept that, end of story, thank you.
Yes, and Hamilton showed them evidence. He showed them the letters and the receipts of payment, things like that. So it wasn't just his word, he actually showed them the documentation. They said that they accepted that documentation. They accepted his explanation, and that it would remain basically in the room, and they would let the issue die.
And yet, shortly thereafter,
A couple years later,
the scandal is leaked. And Hamilton knows there are only a few sources of this leak, so he confronts Monroe and says, "Hey, I thought we were gentlemen here. I thought you said to me that you would maintain confidentiality over this sad thing. Why did you do this?" And Monroe prevaricated and so on. It nearly led to a duel. I think Jefferson knew about this within hours of Madison's knowing about it. Jefferson had to decide what to do about it, and he was probably torn, because I do think that he would be willing to. I don't think he would use this against Hamilton in a salacious way, but he also didn't discipline his troops very well either, and he wanted Hamilton damaged, and the story came out, and it seems to me that if Jefferson had been stronger, this probably wouldn't have leaked.
Yeah, so to be clear, we don't know, it was never revealed, at least to my knowledge, who actually leaked the story to James Callender, who was the newspaper editor that printed the story. I suspect that Monroe told someone, and someone told Callender, and that way Monroe could maintain deniability that he did not tell Callender, and could avoid any repercussions in terms of his honor. It was very clear that he was not interested in dueling with Hamilton, but they came close several times. And what ultimately led to the Reynolds pamphlet is Hamilton felt like he couldn't get any satisfaction. He couldn't get the Jeffersonians to retract this allegation, and so he felt like he had to explain where the money had gone, and it made it, in his hierarchy of embarrassments and honor and slights to his honor, it was better to cop to an affair and blackmail than it was to allow people to think that he had misused public funds.
So much, much, much later, after Hamilton is dead, and as I understand it, Monroe goes to see Mrs. Hamilton, and he says, just wanted to check up on you, and I know it's been rough, and then apparently she really let him have it and said, "If you are willing to admit what you did to damage my husband and me, if you are really, really sincerely sorry, then I will welcome you, but not otherwise." Really a great moment.
It reminds me of the moment when Jefferson went to visit Martha Washington. Wives hold grudges.
Well, they both had reasons to hold grudges, one against Madison and one against Jefferson. But anyway, the leak of the story that came about from Jefferson's closest political friends and his closest protege after Madison, this has to implicate Jefferson in some sense of that term.
I would have trouble believing that he didn't know about it.
And I think if he were surprised, if this is just a thing that happened, he would have written to Hamilton immediately and said, "This should not have happened. I mean, you and I, we have many reasons to dislike each other, but this should not have happened." And he didn't write such a letter.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
Because Jefferson was pretty good about trying to even things out and to create conditions of political harmony. It's a sad story. The whole thing makes me very sad, and to think that the passions were that high, that this would sort of tear apart the early republic. All right, so let me go to the election of 1800. Here, your man Hamilton winds up being a kind of, it goes both ways. When it became clear that the Jeffersonians had won in New York, Hamilton wrote that letter to Governor Jay saying, maybe we change the election procedures ex post facto so things come out a little bit more to our liking, which sounds familiar, doesn't it? And John Jay did not reply, but there's a little note on the letter the document exists where he says, this is not in my interest. This is not something that should happen. So that puts Hamilton in the worst possible light, that he's essentially an election denier. On the other hand, when push came to shove in the House of Representatives and Jefferson and Burr were tied, and no one knew how this impasse was going to be broken, Hamilton was essentially the shadow president of the United States, and everyone turned to him. What's the right thing to do here? Should we deny Jefferson the office? Should we toy with a collapse of the country? And then, as you know, Hamilton said no. Jefferson is the better of the two. It's in everyone's interest to make sure Burr is not the president of this country.
Yeah, so I think it's overstating it a little bit. So I think there are two things that he does. So first, once it's clear that there's a tie, the Federalists in Congress, in particular in the Senate, are thinking about, is there a way that they can pass a bill that will either change how the president is decided, or appoint a temporary president, or create a new round of elections? Is there something they can do like that? And Hamilton I don't think he explicitly says don't do that, but he does not encourage it in any way. And at this point, his influence had waned a little bit in the party because first he had done the Reynolds pamphlet, which was at the beginning of the Adams administration, and then he did the letter to John Adams. And by then, people are thinking like this dude's a little nuts and like can't keep his mouth shut. And one of the things that people said is that, in the letter he accused John Adams of unforgivable vanity, and most people concluded after that letter that Hamilton had unforgivable vanity. And so it really backfired on him. But he still did have a lot of influence with this core of what was called the Essex Junto, and was the core of the most extreme Federalists most of them had been born in Essex County, Massachusetts. They were allied with people in Connecticut, et cetera, et cetera. And so Hamilton doesn't exactly throw cold water on this plan, but he doesn't encourage it. And then the Federalists decide they're going to try and push Burr into the presidency, because if they helped him, he would need to appoint some of them, and he might be more amenable to some of their measures. He might be easier to work with. And they hated Jefferson. They just despised him. And Hamilton was instrumental, I think, in a couple of ways. He didn't necessarily convince a lot of people to support Jefferson, but he convinced an important number of people not to support Burr. So John Marshall was one of the key people that he wrote to. And Marshall basically says, I can't support Jefferson, but I won't support her. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's enough just to urge people to have restraint. And so I think that in this case, he is one of the people who shows sort of just enough civic virtue of putting the good of the country over their own political interests and their own partisan needs at the last moment, and it sort of redeems them for some of their earlier missteps.
Do you know the famous letter that Hamilton wrote saying, Jefferson is the lesser of two evils, he's no great friend to the truth, and he takes his democracy too seriously, and he's a contemptible hypocrite, and he's an intellectual voluptuary, and he gives this litany of reasons to really dislike and distrust Thomas Jefferson, and then he says, but better than Burr.
Burr's worse. Yeah, Burr's worse. Which, is in some ways a really colorful way to cut down Burr.
It's a great moment. I think it's true. I mean, I think Hamilton actually believed that. Like, with Jefferson, we know what we're getting. He's a Southern slaveholder. He tilts towards France. Whereas Burr, who knows what Burr is? So let me ask you that question. What if Burr had been the third president of the United States? Would it really have been a disaster? I mean, why? I mean, Burr knew how to do these things when he presided over the Samuel Chase impeachment hearing. Everyone on both parties thought he did a superb job, that he couldn't have done it better.
Yeah, that's quite a counterfactual. I don't know. I suspect that he might have taken more liberties than Jefferson did with some things. But I think he probably would have risen to the job, and he would have risen to the demands of the office and the position.
I don't think Burr's going to destroy the Constitution. I think he's going to administer it maybe in a way that's a little weird and hard to understand, but I don't see him declaring martial law or invoking the Insurrection Act, which existed.
Correct. I agree with that.
So I think so what I guess I want to say is that Hamilton had a special, deep, fundamental distaste for Aaron Burr that goes way beyond politics.
Yeah, it was personal. I think it was based very much in their past together and their time in New York City politics. They had really gone head to head on a number of issues, and sometimes the people that you know best and have fought against the most personally are the ones that you hate the most. And I think that was certainly true for them.
We're nearly out of time. I have a few more questions for you, Lindsay. And I know that some of these are counterfactual, and I know that's really political heresy, but we're doing it anyway because it's so much fun. What do you think Hamilton admired about Mr. Jefferson?
I think that Hamilton, to use 21st century parlance, game recognizes game. And I think that Hamilton understood Jefferson's, I like to bring in all sorts of slang for you.
Okay, I get it. I had to work on that to even understand it, but he saw they're both engaged in sort of the same business.
He saw Jefferson's political skill, and he admired it, even if he sometimes hated the outcome. So Jefferson and Madison had created this unbelievable political network in Virginia, especially by 1800. They absolutely dominated the state elections. He admired that skill. He admired that ability. He admired the ability to organize and to get people motivated and to work towards a long-term goal. He certainly admired Jefferson's ability to write and his rhetoric and his ability to think big thoughts, even if he often disagreed with them. And there were moments when Jefferson was Secretary of State when he was an ardent defender of executive power on behalf of George Washington. And I think there were times that Hamilton understood that if he could get Jefferson to make an argument, coming from him, it would be more powerful than coming from Hamilton. And so he admired that.
So Madison is brilliant and maybe politically more savvy than Jefferson, a more penetrating thinker, etc. But Madison ain't Jefferson. Did Hamilton admire Jefferson, the Renaissance man, the architect, the man of letters, the gardener, the art connoisseur, the architect, the library scientist?
I think he probably cared less about that. So Hamilton and Jefferson had very different views of what masculinity should be, of what 18th century masculinity and dress and comportment and what it meant to be a man of honor. And so I think that he often thought that Jefferson was a little flimsy in his interests and sort of would shilly-shally about with these highfalutin things like architecture and science and gardening. And real men went into the army and fought and win.
Do you think it's really that stark in terms of masculinity and masculine choices?
Certainly how they presented themselves. I think that Hamilton would have acknowledged a great sort of breadth of opportunity for ways that men could comport themselves. But I think that he admired trade. He admired merchants. He admired economic industry. He admired military bravery. He admired shipbuilders and explorers and things that required a certain amount of, I think, physical bravery. He admired, I think, less people who were philosophers and thought in theoretical ways, which is interesting because, of course, Hamilton was able to produce these incredible things and produce such a great, at least, volume of words. But I think that he generally had less time for men who spent a lot of their time in mental capacity as opposed to physical. What do you think?
I think that's probably right. Hamilton is no slouch. He's more in the science of David Hume than he is in Voltaire and Rousseau. I mean, he's really Scottish Enlightenment more than the European Enlightenment. I think they all felt, okay, we get it. Jefferson's a very great man and, really cultured and exquisite in everything he does. I think they all got that, but it didn't necessarily work for them. But I think they all understood that they were in the presence of a truly remarkable other human being, but maybe not one fitted to be a statesman in a political system.
Well, if he had been less remarkable, he would have been less of a formidable foe in the cabinet. And I think that's probably where the respect came from.
If you had to go to dinner with one of them, who would you want to go to dinner with?
That's a very interesting question.
I didn't say the one you have to date. This is dinner. This is just dinner.
It really did. I don't know. I mean, you would get such different things from them. I think honestly, if I were to have a conversation with Jefferson, obviously he could have talked about so many different things and we share a lot of the same interests. But I wonder if I would come away feeling like we had actually had a deep, meaningful conversation. Because I wonder how many people actually felt that they had a deep and meaningful conversation with him. He was so good at the mask. Whereas like with Hamilton, even if he would have ranted and raved and mansplained over everything I said, which he probably would have, you at least would have known that he was probably being, forthright and honest in what he was saying.
So mansplain now makes its first appearance on this program. So, but Lindsay, I get it, and I agree with you. But if you went to dinner with Hamilton, you would be talked at. He would hold forth. He would, unless he was trying to, seduce you. But if he just takes you as another human being, he would be like wanting so much to prove and so much to talk about and so much to complain about. And if you went with Jefferson, I promise you, the wines would be outstanding.
That's true. That's a really excellent point in his favor.
And you would come away thinking that Jefferson thought you were the most interesting person in the room.
That's true. You make a compelling argument. It would be a good conversation. There would be excellent food. And most importantly, there would be excellent French wine, which is my favorite.
But he would tease out of you some passion for parrots or for Greece or for, haiku. And you would go home and tell your husband, wow, he made me the center of things and he got me and he listened. And
I don't know that I'm that easily impressed.
Well, we know you're not impressed by Jefferson.
Really, the truth is that I would like to have dinner with John Adams, but that's fine.
You know, you had to ruin it. I don't love Hamilton, but I love John Adams. And I think that the Adams-Jefferson relationship is one of the greatest things in American history.
It is. We're so fortunate that we have the documentary record to share that with future generations.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.